evening, it was the Roman emperor and unintentional philosopher Marcus Aurelius who observed that we each encounter deceit, greed, falsehood, failure every day, and yet we're constantly stunned by it. How ridiculous and what a stranger he is, he wrote nearly 1900 years ago as he led an army through the forests of Germany, who is surprised at anything which happens in life. Thus, in our fifth story on the countdown, in this Bush administration, the cell phone service you did not read the fine print contract of presidencies. Why are we surprised that it turns out today that the report on the surge by the latest white knight of Iraq, General David Petraeus, will not be written by General David Petraeus, but will be written by the White House? As Marcus Aurelius would probably say, you dummies are the ones providing the surprise, not Bush. Buried in a Los Angeles Times article this morning, the "oh, didn't you know" revelation that whatever General Petraeus, accompanied by Ambassador Ryan Crocker, is charged to present to Congress next month will not actually be his own work, despite the constant references to that report as his.
General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker will be coming back to report on the findings of the success of the surge. The surge success will not only include military successes and military failures, but also political successes and political failures. How the troops are configured, what the deployment looks like, will depend upon the recommendations of David Petraeus. David Petraeus, the general on the ground, will be bringing his recommendations back to the Congress on or about September the 15th. This September, as Congress has required, General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker will return to Washington to provide a more comprehensive assessment.
To say nothing of the assessments of dozens of nameless staffers and those with nothing but political viewpoints from the White House. And say nothing is exactly what they did. Having been caught, the White House now insisting that the report was never going to be from General Petraeus, that it was always going to be from the president.
The Congress asked for these reports from the president. They asked for the president to report to the Congress. And so the July 15th report will be no different to the September 15th report in terms of how that worked. And the president has said that he's going to take the recommendations from General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker, and then he will consult further before deciding on any possible next course of action.
As to those recommendations that are not really his, General Petraeus telling reporters in Baghdad that he is going to recommend troop cuts in September, that he believes the U.S. presence in Iraq should be considerably smaller by next summer, but that a quick withdrawal could hurt any progress made. Some other officials telling the L.A. Times they expect the troops to withdraw from some areas, maybe Anbar province, but to remain in Iraq for another 6 months to help in Baghdad. More on the military plans in a moment. First, the latest wool polling by the president. I'm joined by Congressional Quarterly columnist, our MSNBC analyst, Craig Crawford. Craig, good evening.
Hi, Keith.
Again, we're all victims of not listening to Marcus Aurelius. We shouldn't be surprised, but we are. What happens now politically? Don't the Democrats just pull this thing and the general and the president apart as duplicitous and deceptive and cheap?
Well, and also, Keith, there are Republicans who are bound to be nervous about this development, because many Republicans were using the prospect of the Petraeus report as cover way back in the last wave or two of votes on Iraq to say, we're going to wait for this report and then we'll make a firm decision. They were buying time for themselves before the next election to see where they needed to be. And then, on the other hand, Democrats were also using it to some extent with their own base voters. When they couldn't get enough votes to override vetoes, they were telling their liberal base voters, once this Petraeus report comes in, Republicans will defect and we'll be able to override vetoes. And now it looks like none of that's going to happen.
So what happens when a report with no credibility behind it, certainly no credibility of General Petraeus behind it, since he's not going to be the author, maybe not even the principal voice in it, what happens then to that whole series of dominoes that we're expected to go over from both sides in September? Is that whole reevaluation process in September still alive, or was it just knocked over?
I'm not ever sure it was very real to begin with, Keith. It smelled to me like a ruse on the part of the White House. Another bit of footwork in the rope-a-dope with Congress to keep this war going just like the president wants it to go. This will be the fifth wave of voting, if we have, and as we probably will in the fall, on Capitol Hill on the war. And Also, Democrats, I'm not going to be so cynical as to say they're thinking this, Keith, but there is a dirty truth that Democrats are better off with things just like they are, because if in the next election they can argue for winning the White House and keeping control of Congress, the only way to get real change in Iraq is to vote for a Democrat. If they were actually to get a handle on this war and play a role in the management of it, they might lose that argument.
But why then did the White House play into that aspect of this, given certainly the goodwill, whether it was forced or legit, that was being offered in terms of General Petraeus? He was being given credibility by both sides for whatever their motives were. Why did the White House not take advantage of this, and instead of buying time with counterfeit money, buy time with this general's respectability?
Exactly. I find it fascinating, this development, because it suggests one of two things, really, is that they are very confident that they've got the votes, they can hold enough Republicans, especially in the House, to forestall any serious efforts by Congress and to keep the vetoes solid, and don't feel they even need this little routine in September anymore. Or they began to see where Petraeus might be going with the report and feared letting him have too much control over it and wanted to get a hand in it. It'll be a little time before we know which of those it is.
Do you think we're ever going to know what General Petraeus' actual assessment of the situation in Iraq is, an assessment that has not been whitewashed, politicized, or we might even just call it White Housed now?
Well, when he gets on the griddle in the hearings, which I'm sure will come, he'll be testifying after this report, and I'm sure a lot of Democrats, including some running for president, may get in the act and pound him pretty hard to get what he really thinks out of him. He's a pretty candid guy, and he had a lot of respect among Democrats. The whole problem here is there's really two things going on. The combat ground truth, which he's supposed to try to bring back to Washington and tell policymakers what's really happening, and then the political games of using him as a way to buy time for Republicans and Democrats, for that matter.
I believe the quote was attributed to Boke Carter, the 1930s newscaster. In war, truth is the first casualty, or in this case, it seems to multiply. Our own Craig Crawford, columnist for Congressional Quarterly, is always great. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.